Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Today, our guest is Marissa Ortega-Welch, a San Francisco-based freelance journalist who focuses on environmental issues. Last year, she generated a series of podcasts surrounding the topic of official wilderness, the history of official wilderness, and the idea of wilderness. It's an interesting series that you can find by searching for How Wild wherever you download your podcasts. As a journalist who writes on environmental issues, Marissa often finds herself tracking down stories involving the national parks. But like many other reporters, these days that's not an easy task. Marissa is our guest today and will explain why she chose to do a series on wilderness and discuss the problems she's had recently trying to cover national parks.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Marissa.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's great to make time to catch up with a fellow journalist and podcaster. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I stumbled across your podcast on wilderness, How Wild podcast. How did that come about?
Yes, I put out a podcast in the late summer of last year called How Wild, and it's about wilderness and how it's changing. And it actually came about because I am a big backpacker myself. I've been backpacking all over the West, all over the country for the last 20 years, and I was hiking on a section of the Pacific Crest Trail in Washington State, and I asked somebody who was coming the other way, another backpacker, to tell me a little bit about the trail up ahead and where the next water source would be. And instead of this party telling me, just what they'd experienced, they pulled out their smartphone and opened up an app to give me the exact next water source. And that just sort of blew my mind. I wasn't using an app to hike yet. I started noticing how many other people were using technology on the trail. And that got me thinking a lot about how wilderness was changing with things like the increase in technology, also things like climate change affecting, these wilderness areas as places that are supposed to be quote unquote natural. So I started diving into the Wilderness Act, which is the law that governs the wilderness areas where I backpack. And I just became really fascinated by how the definition and concept of wilderness both had been created over time, but then also how it was being tested right now because of things like I said, technology, climate change, increase in people visiting wilderness areas, and land managers having to grapple with, what does wilderness mean in this time of a lot of change?
You mentioned technology and apps, and I'm an old school guy. I'm from the last century. What do you think about that kind of stuff? I mean, I grew up with, topographic maps and tried to learn a little bit with compass. And you don't need that stuff anymore. I mean, when I was a young man, shortly out of college, I drove across the country from West Virginia to Sun Valley, Idaho for a winter job. And, you jumped on the highway, you drove to, St. Louis, and then you kept going on the highway, and then you turned north at Fort Collins, basically Colorado, and then you got to Cheyenne, and you turned west until you got to Twin Falls, Idaho, and you went north to Sun Valley. And I'm in the middle of this cross country road trip, and I'm overly relying on my phone to tell me how to get to where I'm going. That's weird.
hmm
That's weird.
Right. Yeah. It hasn't just changed in our hiking and backpacking lives, right? It's changed for our front country lives as well. The technology question is really complicated. I also started backpacking using Map and Compass. I still bring a paper map with me. But I think a lot more people are using their phones to navigate. It's not just the map itself. There's all these apps that will tell you about like where to camp. There's also a lot of technology that we utilize before we even leave on our trips, right? Researching these trails and learning about them and helping us decide where to go. So I think that there are actually a lot of ways that technology can really benefit us in terms of experiencing a place like the wilderness. I've tried to resist my own knee jerk reaction of feeling like, oh, this isn't how it's supposed to be, right? I grew up with a map and compass. I think that it helps a lot of people get out to these places. It helps them find these places, first of all, on the internet, helps them get out there. And it helps some people that maybe don't know how to use a map and compass, who maybe don't feel comfortable out there alone in the wilderness without their phone. It helps them feel more comfortable. So it's actually increasing access, which I think is a good thing if we want, all people in this country to be able to access public lands. But then, there's this sort of double-edged sword to it where, like you said, when you become over-reliant on your phone, that's when the issue is, right? So if your phone dies, then do you know actually how to sort of read the land and figure out how to, navigate where you're going? Did you even bring a backup map? I mean, I met people that just didn't even bring a backup map. They maybe brought a backup phone. If there were two people in their hiking party or more, everyone had their phone, so they could rely on that.
No, I think exactly where you're going. I mean, there have been instances where people are in the backcountry with their spot locator device, and there was a case at the Grand Canyon where I think the party ran out of food or ran out of water, and other than that, they were perfectly fine. But they hit the help me button, and it's just crazy.
I talked to a search and rescue captain in the Eastern Sierra who said that his office has seen people using their inReach devices, right, their satellite devices, or just their phones to call his office and say that they are cold or tired, right? So people thinking, sort of abusing what search and rescue is for and just asking to be quote unquote rescued when really there's not an emergency. And they've also seen an increase in just people actually having emergencies as more people visit public lands that maybe don't have all of the skills or know how to be out in an area like a wilderness, a remote area. So it's definitely a double-edged sword with technology.
It really is. It really is. I know. I was talking to some of the Avalanche Center folks in Salt Lake City, and just the improved technology in backcountry skis was getting people in over their heads because their equipment was much better than their abilities. And so they were going farther out in the backcountry. Then all of a sudden, like, oh, I'm in trouble. But yeah,
Right, exactly.
it's crazy. So, but your How Wild podcast, where is that going?
So I put out season 1 last summer, and there's 7 episodes, and I dive into each of these words in the Wilderness Act, right? Like the idea of primitive recreation. What does primitive mean right now in the era of smartphone technology? Or what does natural mean right now in the era of climate change? So that was really focused on the Wilderness Act and how it's changing. I would like to now do a season 2, and I have a couple of different ideas for it. I will say that funding right now for independent podcasts like mine is harder and harder to come by. The first season was funded by the California state arm of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And that organization has gone the way similar to national parks and forests and public lands right now, all federal agencies. It's being drastically cut. So thinking about funding sources and then also thinking about what stories I can tell, because this is something I would love to hear from you too. But as a journalist, I'm talking to a ton of people who work in public lands right now, but nobody wants to talk to me on the record. So the reporting I did for season 1 of How Wild, going out, I went out with biologists on the trail in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park or a wilderness ranger on the trail in the Maroon Bells of Colorado and have, these sounds and scenes of us in the field in wilderness areas, federal wilderness areas. I can't do that right now. I don't think that I'm going to be able to tell stories from federal lands right now because people just are afraid for losing their jobs.
Yeah, yeah, no, I get that. But yes, you kind of pointed in the direction of where I wanted to talk to you about was public lands reporting under the second Trump administration, and specifically national parks. I've been doing this journalism professionally for 40 years, over 40 years, and I have never seen it so difficult to get federal employees to talk. I mean, the National Parks Traveler is the Washington office of the National Park Service treats it as a national media, which on one hand, gee, that's very nice. We really appreciate you doing that. But that means that any questions we have for a specific park, they usually have to run it up to Washington for their approval to talk to us. It's just crazy the way things are going now. And as you mentioned, getting federal employees to talk about anything now is darn impossible.
Right. I mean, maybe something your listeners would want to know is the sort of behind the scenes when you are doing a national story about a national park. What I do is I email my contact. Let's say I want to do a story about Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park in California, where I live. I email the public information officer there and say I want to do a story about X, and they say, okay, we need to check with national office, and they run it up the flagpole. It comes back down, and then they say, okay, all clear, right? And that's the coming back down from the national office is just not happening right now. We're not getting the all clear to do the stories at these parks, and that makes my job very difficult. And I think it's concerning for just telling stories and getting information out about these places.
Yeah, yeah. Or the response comes down and it's pretty much pablum that you really can't use.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's 2 sentences. That's a very sort of stock reply.
Yeah, yeah. And what's really troubling, I mean, there's so many things that are troubling, but the one thing that really troubles me, the national park system is held in trust for the American public. We should be able to get information about how the national parks are being operated and how they're being run. And Congress is just sitting back and afraid to do anything to get in the face of the Trump administration. I don't know. What's an additional complicating factor with what's going on is, they had the Fork in the Road program where you can retire now. We'll keep you on the payroll until September and keep paying you, but you don't have to go to work. We've reached out to some of those people, and they don't want to talk because they're afraid that if their name gets out there, that Washington will cut them off, and you won't get the rest of your retirement.
Right. That makes sense. I understand that people are fearful for their jobs or their livelihoods or their future. It makes sense, but it makes it really hard to tell these stories. Even the stories, obviously both people like you and I are interested in telling the stories right now about these cuts and how they're impacting national parks. But even stuff that isn't being cut, let's say, people are afraid to talk about it because they don't want to draw attention to a program. Like, for example, I was talking to a national park in California that they have an internship program that helps young people move into the environmental field. And the internship program is about many things. It brings in kids and young adults from all over the state. It's not like a DEI program, right? Officially a DEI program. And yet, because the program has a lot of young adults in it, participants who are from underrepresented communities in national parks and the environmental field, no one wants to talk about this program because they don't want to draw attention to it. So even the sort of good news stories, right, that are usually the easiest ones to tell, people just want to keep their head down right now.
Yeah, they really do. And, we've tried to, we saw the writing on the wall with Project 2025 and, climate change is false and we're going to defund climate change. And so we tried to get out in front of that and talk to people who get, climate change funding from the Park Service. And their response was, please don't report on this because we don't want to raise the profile of it and let the administration know what we're doing so they can cut the funding. And my reply to that is, I'm sure the administration knows what they want to cut, and I'm sure they know what programs are out there. And would you rather us raise the profile of the good work that you're doing, or prefer that we write a story about the good work you were doing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's hard for me to weigh in because I'm not on the inside. I don't know. I don't know if the folks who are at the top of DOI right now and people who are in the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, I don't know how, what's the word I want to use? It sort of feels like it's just these big cuts without a lot of thought behind them. I mean, I talked to an academic who their program got cut because they think it got cut because the title of the project had the word biodiversity in it. And a couple people I've talked to have sort of confirmed that this seems like a good theory that somebody within Doge was, sort of using AI or doing, the equivalent of Control F find within government contracts for the word diversity. And so things like biodiversity were sort of the collateral damage in that search and cut system. So I don't know how thoughtful the cuts actually are. They feel like they're being sort of done with a machete, very broad strokes. So I do understand people's fear to talk, but you bring up a good point. I mean, we do have to keep reporting on the good things that are happening in public lands and all of the stories coming out of public lands in general. And figuring out how to do that is, I guess, our job for the next 4 years.
Yeah, it's a challenge. We've been working at the Traveler on a story about the hit the Alaska Regional Office of the National Park Service took. They had roughly 180 people in the regional office, and they cut roughly 60. Apparently, with that sledgehammer, without taking a look at who they were cutting. I mean, they got rid of the head of aviation. And if you're working in Alaska, you have to fly to get around. And so this is the National Park Service aviation program that it doesn't involve visitors to the national parks, but it involves getting stuff to national parks for visitors, getting the supplies and whatnot. And they cut the head of aviation. They cut the inventory and monitoring program, which has been tracking climate change impacts in Alaska, as well as many other things. Tribal liaison, they cut that person. It's just crazy what they're cutting.
Yeah, and if you think about the reduction in workforce that was supposed to happen, this increase in staff cuts that's currently on pause. I mean, my understanding of how that worked is everybody at the Department of Interior, like the national parks, had to send in their resume up to Doge, and apparently someone at Doge is reviewing that and then deciding who to cut. And you think about the bottleneck of, there's only a couple people from Doge in DOI right now. Just the how can they make those decisions in a way that is thoughtful and timely if they do want to move quickly on these workforce cuts? I mean, I think if you really wanted to sort of in good faith address efficiency issues or any sort of bloat as Doge says that it wants to address in a place like the national parks, wouldn't it make more sense if you really did want to make cuts to the national parks? Wouldn't it make more sense to go to the regional offices and go to the units and say, look, we have to cut your budget by X%. You make the decision based on how you can still continue to fulfill the mission of your park unit. Again, if that was your mandate was to make cuts, wouldn't it make more sense to ask the people on the ground to make these decisions? But it doesn't feel like the most efficient way to make these cuts.
No. I think that's what the Clinton administration did. They gave the various federal departments 6 months to go through all their work processes and decide which were superfluous and whatnot. And they saved hundreds of thousands of dollars in cutting. And what Doge is doing, as you mentioned, there doesn't seem to be any strategic thought put into it, and a lot of the stuff they're having to reverse. And so they're not saving any money. It doesn't seem like it. And when you talk about the Park Service, roughly $3 billion budget, it's 1/15 of 1% of the federal budget. So, what are you really saving?
And right, what is it? How much money we put into the parks in relation to how much money they create for the economy? I mean, the national parks are an economic driver, right? In terms of tourism, within the park itself, but also in the gateway communities that surround these parks. These are money makers for those towns.
Well, and it goes beyond dollars and cents in the cash register when you start talking about natural capital in biodiversity, and the white bark pine trees that serve as snow fences that control spring runoff and moderate stream flows. The value of a bear in Yellowstone or a wolf in Yellowstone, there is much more money, in my opinion, held in the natural capital of the national park system than what we're seeing at the gateway communities. It's a story I hope to get to one of these days. I mean, people have actually done studies on not just the economic value of a grizzly bear, but of marshlands and whatnot. It's really impressive how much these public lands provide for us, and the administration doesn't seem to be interested in that.
Well, I will say I'm talking to a lot of people, and I want to be clear that, we sort of talked about people being fearful for losing their jobs and keeping their head down. That's on the record. Off the record, people are very eager to talk. And I'm seeing a lot of frustration and a lot of sadness, but also a lot of resistance. So have been talking to people who work in wilderness for the last 4 years for my How Wild podcast, and it's been really great to continue to draw on those relationships, continue to talk to people and hear how they're being impacted. And, again, what people are telling me is, they're frustrated, they're fearful that they're not going to be able to fulfill their mission. These are really, as you know, mission-driven people. They really feel like they need to protect these places, and they are going to, in some cases, really do whatever it takes. So even in the face of massive staff cuts and budget cuts, they feel like they are going to try to, keep these public lands open for recreation this summer while also trying to protect the resources as much as possible. So I think people feel that they need to do their job. What I worry about from the outside is, how long can you do that before you burn out, right? And then I think people are organizing. There is a group called the Resistance Rangers. It's a sort of ad hoc group of off-duty park rangers who have been organizing off the job to do things like have protests within national parks, protesting these budget cuts. It was back in March, I believe. They had protests at over 100 national parks, protesting the DOGE cuts. And then on their website, their Resistance Rangers website, they've been documenting some of the changes that they've been seeing in national parks, especially in relation to some of the administration's executive orders around, what type of language and messaging about American history can and can't be said on federal land.
Yeah, that was a pretty funny thing. We ran that story in the Traveler, and it went viral. We had one day 105,000 readers come to the site, and we've removed comments from the articles because that just gets too crazy. Moderating public comments on a site our size is near impossible, but people found the contact button, and all those contact emails come to my inbox. And what was really interesting was I was criticized from both sides. People were saying that I was being unfair to the National Park Service, and people were saying you're supporting the Trump administration, what they're trying to do. It was kind of interesting that I guess if you're getting criticized from both sides, you must be doing your job right.
Right. Wait, which story was it that went viral?
It was about the secretarial order to put
mhm.
signs up in the national, all federal land agencies. Do you see any messaging that you disagree with that is mischaracterizing or disparaging Americans? And what was really interesting about the secretarial order was they were just interested in signage that went up during the Biden administration.
Right.
It's just bizarre. It's just bizarre.
Right. I mean, we've seen this since almost day one, right? The first thing was, and people maybe saw the news about Stonewall National Monument removing the word transgender from their website, and that is a national monument that is specifically about the history of the transgender movement and celebrating transgender people in this country. So to remove that is, it felt a little bit like, what is it? 2 + 2 = 5. It just, you can't talk about Stonewall without talking about transgender people. And that got a lot of attention, but there's been a lot more sort of quiet or less advertised ways that these websites are being changed. And now this recent secretarial order to have signs up to ask people to report if there's any language being used disparaging American history. It's really interesting. I haven't heard, and I wonder if you have any specific examples yet of those signs going up. But, we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. And we keep asking readers when they go out into the parks to report back on what they see. But I'm curious, Is this something that journalists are going to have to deal with for the next 4 years? This type of lack of transparency, lack of communications, and if that's the case, are you going to continue to report on public lands agencies?
I feel committed. I feel like as public lands reporters, we have to double down. I was recently at the Society of Environmental Journalists conference, and an investigative journalist there gave a talk, and she said, "We're all investigative journalists now," which was an interesting rallying cry, but also a good point, that we just have to be willing to dig a little deeper. I think, journalists, we don't like to go off the record, right? It's not as sort of credible to have people just stay anonymous. You want to be able to attribute quotes to names. So how do we, respect people's desire to stay anonymous and protect their job security and allow them, to go off the record? So for me, that means I have to make sure, can I confirm that these people actually work for the national parks, right? Can they prove that to me, even if they're not willing to go off on the record? So maybe they're giving me information, but I'm not revealing it to the reader or listener. And then can I corroborate what they're saying and get multiple sources who are telling me the same thing? But it's really hard in radio. In radio, I want to hear people's voices, right? In print, you can have, anonymous sources, but radio is a lot harder. And I was actually talking about this with a journalist friend this weekend. She did a story. She's not a public lands reporter, but she did a story once where she distorted the person's voice in the story. And, to me, that feels very like witness protection program. I don't think it makes for very good radio necessarily. But that's what she had to do in order to tell that story. So I don't, yeah.
I've got this GarageBand app on my iPad, and one of the voices you can use is like Alvin from the Chipmunks.
No.
So,
Wow.
yeah, it might be interesting, but
Yeah.
it's sad at the same time. I really do worry about the natural resources in the park system because they're cutting indiscriminately, and the Interior Secretary Doug Burgum has ordered the Park Service to make sure visitors have a great time this summer, even if however you manage to do that. And it sounds like, well, we're going to pull people out of the inventory and monitoring or resource protection and put them on the front lines, and nobody's going to be paying attention in the backcountry. We're going to lose a lot of crucial information, if not a lot of resources as well.
Right. Yeah. I talked to one person on a habitat restoration crew. She had a really good example or visual, which is that, this is in a place like the national parks we have here in the Bay Area where you're allowed to bring your dog, that you might notice more dog poop on the trail this summer, but you're not going to notice because of the staff cuts, but you're not going to notice the invasive plants that are growing on the side of the trail. Because if you're not sort of trained to look for that stuff, you may not notice what's being impacted right now. And it may not be obvious this year yet. It may be the sort of backlog of fire management, right? That's going to build up over the next 4 years that we're then going to be paying for down the line.
Absolutely. And, back in 2020, when the COVID pandemic hit, a lot of research was put on hold for a while. And I'm guessing that the same thing is happening now. I've got a reporter working on, reaching out to researchers, asking them, are you still doing research in the national parks? If not, what's happening to the information that you've gathered so far? It's going to be an interesting story. Hopefully not too disheartening.
Right.
So against all this doom and gloom, are you getting out to the parks, having a good time?
I live in the Bay Area, so I live in the city, but I do have some local national parks that I have been visiting on day hikes. And then I am actually going to hike the John Muir Trail this summer. That was something I was supposed to do last year, but I postponed it because I was putting out the podcast. So I'm going to be hiking the John Muir Trail, which will be really interesting to be out there in the backcountry and see firsthand how things are going. But I'm also, I shouldn't even say this out loud, knock on wood, as a Californian, we shouldn't speak these things into existence, but I'm really worried about fire this year. And, that's been impacting backpacking for years. Every year it feels like you're just sort of hoping that you can get out in between the fires and the smoke. But this is a worrisome year. And then to think that on top of that, sort of the overall emergency services response may be down is concerning.
Yeah. Have you seen the fires in Canada?
No, I haven't.
They have huge wildfires in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The pictures were horrific. The walls of flame just going across the landscape. And, I've been driving across the country, and Iowa was pretty darn smoky. And I'm in
Oh,
Illinois now, and it's pretty smoky as well. So, hopefully you didn't jinx everybody, because
I know. I'm sorry.
it's a it's a huge concern, both because of the loss of resources and because of the question of whether there's enough personnel to fight fires. This back and forth with seasonal jobs. We're gonna withdraw the offers. Oh, we're gonna reverse ourselves. You can hire 7,000 people, and the back and forth causes, I think, a lot of people to second guess where they want to go to work. I mean, do you want
Oh, yeah.
to sign up for the program not knowing whether you'll have it in 3 months or 2 months? I mean, because the rifts supposedly are coming, even though the courts have put them on hold.
Absolutely. I've talked to seasonal interpretive rangers who were supposed to start months ago, and their start date keeps getting pushed back. I talked to people who were fired during the probationary employee cuts, brought back on, only then to have their term end. Right? They were on a term position, and their term ended, and they were told that they were going to be able to renew, but then they were let go. And I don't know if that was attributed to the hiring freeze or what, but just this this back and forth, this whiplash that people are experiencing. It makes total sense to me that people would be looking for jobs elsewhere. I've talked to people who work for the National Park Service who are now thinking about going and working for the concessionaires instead, because that's more stable employment, which I think that's really interesting to me, especially in a place like Yosemite where we have a big concessionaire presence in a park like that. Most folks go the other way. You get your job, sort of cooking in a restaurant in Yosemite Valley because it's your dream to live in a national park, and then you move up to a coveted position with the National Park Service, right? These are supposed to be government career jobs. They're stable, they have benefits, and you get to work for this agency for the rest of your life. And to see people going the other way is really shocking. I talked to somebody who said, I thought this was a really interesting point too, that the main two groups that the national parks are losing right now are the people who just started, right? So maybe some of those probationary employees who were in the first year or two of their position, or seasonal workers that weren't rehired, who were coming in with a lot of energy and new ideas, the sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed people that were going to be at the start of their career, and bring that energy and excitement into the agency. We've been losing them. And then we're also losing people who were getting toward the end of their career, who maybe took the voluntary early retirement because they sort of saw the writing on the wall for their job, or just thought, this isn't how I want to end my career. And they took with them all their institutional knowledge. So to think about that was really interesting to me. We're losing the energy and vitality of the new hires, and then the institutional knowledge of people who have been in these parks for decades. That's a huge loss on both ends.
In more ways than you can imagine. And we're working on some stories tied to that.
Hmm.
Well, Marissa, it's been great to catch up with you. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And, if you do some freelance work, give me a call.
Thank you. Thanks.
Your trip on the John Muir Trail, I'm very envious of that. And, that could be an interesting podcast itself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think my best friend who I hike with might kill me for I'm always recording whenever we go hiking. At some point, I have to put the recorder down and just live my life and be a backpacker again. But yeah, I'll probably bring my recorder with me. We'll see.
That should be fun. When are you going?
The beginning of August.
Oh, okay. Should be fun. I've got a friend, a colleague, who she's done it several times, and it's something that's on my bucket list. I just haven't got around to it. The list, the bucket is overflowing.
Absolutely. Yeah, as it should be. There's a lot of beautiful things to experience in this world. I've section hiked most of it, but I've never done the whole thing in one go. So it'll be interesting. It's a lot of logistic planning. It's not as fun, but it'll be really fun once we're out there.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll have a blast. Well, thanks so much, Marissa. Have a great summer and stay in touch.
Thank you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. And we hope we peeled back some of the layers that help explain why it's difficult much more difficult these days to cover America's best idea. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repanshek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.